I'm excited to be chairing this session on methods because I think it's one of the real strengths of the DMRC and why we attract such high quality HDR students. We've got three speakers in this session, or three papers, and our first one is Dan Angus, who's going to be talking about computational methods for studying information disorder. Please welcome Dan.
Thank you, Michelle. Let me just wake this up. Perfect. So my name's Dan Angus. I'm a professor here in QT's Digital Media Research Centre. I lead a program called Computational Communication and Culture, and also hang around, I guess, a lot in the other programs in the DMRC. Because look, I'm the methods dude, right? I do computational methods. And look, we've heard a lot about computational methods already this morning. We're going to hear a lot more in this session and this afternoon. They're kind of the bread and butter of studying these various issues, these very important issues. And I want to take some time after lunch, because I know everyone's kind of in the post-lunch slump now, to maybe enliven us around some issues that we need to consider in the development of our methods and their application. So a good place to start this is some thinking that's emerging from a PhD project by Dennis Leeftink, who's one of our DMRC PhD candidates. He's with myself and also Axel. And his project's called No Tool is a Box, Unpacking Embedded Knowledge to Address Tool Language Barriers. One of the key contributions that Dennis is making at the moment is around this idea and this notion of the computational stack. And the computational stack being something that's prevalent everywhere, but I'm going to talk about it here in terms of our research. The consideration of when we're putting together a research project, how we kind of stack or arrange certain kinds of computational libraries, methods, approaches in sequencing our kind of data workflows, the ways in which we go about collecting, refining, analysing, interpreting, and then communicating our various insights around our research. And it's really useful thinking, because thinking in terms of these stacks allows us to figure out where are the fundamental limitations, where are we getting, say, maybe locked into particular ways of doing, where might we be able to break free of that a little bit. And there's some reflections here. I'll also go back to Kate's amazing talk this morning in our kind of plenary around the kind of gaps, I guess, as I see in this landscape, particularly around things like image and video, the real, seen as the challenging kind of modalities to study when we think about studying information disorder. So yeah, I'll come back and touch on this idea of stack as we move through. So here's one example of a kind of a pseudo stack. And it's one that's used in a lot of our research when we're studying these things. You've heard about some of this already. And it involves, three basic steps, right? The collection of some kind of data, it's pre-processing, so the way in which we clean it, refine it, filter it, and then how we analyze this. So how do we go about making sense of what we find in there? So there's some dominant ways of collection that we use here at DMRC. We do a lot of API-based collection, Twitter, these kinds of things. Web scraping as well. Myself and my team do a lot around web scraping of Instagram data, and things like web archives and dashboards, CrowdTangle and other kinds of web interfaces that allow us to get large data sets and work with them. Pre-processing, things like filtering out from those data sets things of interest, keywords or other selection techniques. URL expansion and resolution. When we gather Twitter data, we often end up with shortened URLs, so we do some work to try and expand those and get an accurate URL that's actually expanded and resolved. And then analysis. You've already heard today about a lot of descriptive statistics, other kinds of network analysis, topic modeling, close reading, the importance of that. Like Kate was mentioning in her work, the mixed methods. Everything we do here is mixed methods, I would say, almost with certainty, that we do a lot of that kind of moving out and moving in what we do. And of course, a lot more than that. So I'm going to walk through a bunch of common tools that we use here, not kind of assuming that everybody, say online or in the room, is aware of all of these stacks and how we create them. So CrowdTangle is one platform we use a lot within any kind of research that kind of aligns to Facebook, and in some cases also Instagram, because that you can access some Instagram data via CrowdTangle, of course, as well. What CrowdTangle provides is approved researchers, and I'll come back to this in my reflection, access to selected public Facebook materials. You get things such as URLs that are posted to, in posts made to Facebook, pictures that are associated with a post, text, reactions, number of comments, but you don't get the text of the comments itself. So a limited snapshot, in a way, of Facebook data that's posted publicly in those spaces that are indexed by CrowdTangle itself. And if you are one of the chosen few, that CrowdTangle decide to allow access into this specific platform. So yes, there are limitations. Public spaces only, no data on non-public groups, no data on public or non-public profile activity of individuals. It sits at a domain level analysis only. There's very patchy coverage, not all pages, it's not an entire platform sample in that sense. And I think for me, the most challenging aspect of it is it's a privileged access model. So yes, we have access to this here. We are very fortunate to have access to it, but there is no such thing as universal access to this particular tool, which is inherently problematic for democratizing access and enabling all kinds of diverse research to happen on this particular platform. Conversely, you've got Twitter and Twitter's much famous API. I want to reflect, there's a great tweet that a good colleague, Cornelius Bushman, who's probably known to many here, made this morning, and I just had to read it out. Cornelius said, doing ICA 22 reviews, my suggestion is to split the conference in two, with the first half for papers about Twitter and the other half for the rest. Right? Now, I love it because there's an ongoing joke around the over kind of reliance or focus on Twitter, particularly at big conferences like International Communication Association. Even today, we should feel a little bit seen, right? It's like there's a lot on Twitter. Now, there are reasons for this, right? Twitter's API, all things said, is pretty damn good, right? It has provided a good level of access into data that we can then study. And there have been further refinements. The Twitter API version 2, I think, is a marked improvement in how we start to have more of a conversation around how academics can access platform-based data. It's not perfect, right? There are still fundamental limitations to it, but it is moving in a direction I think is positive compared to my fears around movements of key individuals out of CrowdTangle, for example, and ways that seemingly in what I'm reading in the tea leaves, CrowdTangle is going to be left to just kind of drift off into, the sunset a little bit, perhaps not receive the continued investment and perhaps not chasing, this kind of a model of how do we do better? How do we engage the academic community better? So yeah, there are loads of tools available for Twitter. Twat, Tweepy, TCATs, we use pretty much all of these. I'm looking at Jane and Laura over there on the coalface of this most days, dealing with these particular tools and others in the room. Yeah, these are well referenced, well-supported tools with a large community around developing and improving them all the time. And it does. It means it allows for good large-scale mapping and analysis, and even with the improvements, now we've got historical search and expanded data download that can happen. It's a model of doing good, right? It works to a degree. So within this, once we have access into data in some form, how do we get through that? How do we kind of separate out and find the needles in the haystack, if you will? Well, there are a number of approaches that we use across the DMRC to do this. So one that is a really interesting approach that largely came from the big brain of Axel Bruns over there is to use lists of things like URLs. URLs are a really interesting entity, really interesting affordance. So many platforms support the embedding of URLs, and they tell us something really interesting, I think. So where people are sharing, information, links to news sites or other things. So what fakeness is, and Axel's going to talk a little bit more about this in another paper in a little while, is a list of very problematic sites, fake news websites that come from a list of papers, and there's a couple thousand domains in this list that's growing as we add to it. what we can do with this is we can download data from things like, in this case, CrowdTangle. We also do this with Twitter, to gather any post that mentions or embeds one of these URLs. And that gives us a really interesting data set through which we can start to understand linking practices to these problematic sites. And you end up with this kind of network analysis where you can start to map out spaces around key groups. In this case, I won't say too much because there is a whole paper on this in a sec, but yeah, you can start to map whole 30,000, kind of foot views of information disorder across a whole platform by using URLs as your kind of point of filtering. Other ways to filter are things like hashtags, right? So a paper that Tim Graham and myself, Axel, Eddie, and Sam Hames published around the whole Victorian situation with that kind of Dictator Dan versus I Stand with Dan debate, which obviously is kind of heating up again at the moment. We used hashtags to examine issue publics, and that was a really good strategy for isolating actors and other activities that were, prominent within that particular debate on Twitter at the time. So yeah, keywords, hashtags, another useful way to filter, sort, and refine the data you want to obtain. Other ways we can do this are following key actors themselves. So in a lot of coverage of elections, we do things like looking for @mentions or following the accounts of politicians or people who are registered as kind of running candidates within a political contest. So generate a list of known key accounts, gather anything that's attached to them, and then analyze that. What you're seeing here is just a bigram analysis of key kind of slogans, if you will, attached to various political parties in the lead up to the 2019 Australian Fed election. This paper's only days away from coming out in Social Media and Society, so we just signed off the proof, and it'll be there very, very soon in what will be a great special issue actually around elections all around the world, and some great work in that one, so look out for it in a few days. But yeah, this idea of following key accounts, key informants to get a sample from those is another strong filtering strategy. So look, to bring this to a bit of a close, some reflections. What I think we have right now and what we've seen today, and I've showcased a little bit here, is some incredibly refined, well-accepted, and quite powerful ways to analyse within single modalities, so just text or network or some kind of singular affordance on a platform. And for a major public platform. We can do Facebook pretty well, we can do Twitter pretty well. I'm pushing the boundaries on Instagram at the moment, and I think we can do that pretty well at the moment. But what I'm seeing less of is, and I know there is work emerging on this, and I guess want to give it a bit of encouragement and air, is the cross-platform analyses, right? How do we link across? Because more than not, what we're seeing is key actors or activities not just inhabiting one platform. Kate was talking this morning around the distinguishing of the key organisational activities that might occur in closed Facebook spaces, Telegram, and these versus the outward kind of, broader public conversation issue publics that emerge, say, on Twitter or elsewhere. And we need that work. We need that work that tracks that activity as it moves and bleeds across those platforms as well. And for me, as the computational methodologist, it's kind of imperative on other computational nerds to make that happen, right? That, we need better tools, right? Because it is janky at the moment to try and connect these things together. It's very easy to just grab data from one platform, refine it, chuck it through a network, Gephi or something like that, and have that. It is still that bit more effort to go and then actually combine from multiple different sources into one. So yeah, better tooling and support for that, where researchers are really keen to do it. The multimodality as well, right? So a key kind of shout out to Rio, who's a new PhD student with Tim, and also as me as associate, looking across. So, within a tweet, you have the text, but you have an image. You have like what Luke was talking about. You have mimetic cultures as well. With all of these layers of information that move across modalities, we need better ways to actually take account of all of those modalities together, right? So we've got good techniques, I think, to do each by themselves. we need to do more now to bring those together. So how text impacts then on the image, how the time of day, how the connections, how the subtlety of some of this communication can only be seen and analysed when we combine all those things together into one. So yeah, better approaches for doing that. And look, the last thing I'll leave on is that fight for platform transparency. We need to push back continually, right? As I said, Twitter is on the path. They're doing better, but it's not best and it's not perfect, right? Facebook have a long way to go. Other platforms, Google, right, is the big one on my list at the moment. YouTube, Google's ad transparency, it's shocking, right? It is absolutely appalling, the complete lack of transparency around key activities happening on those platforms. And we need to continue to fight for that. And the platforms need to get behind this, right? Because it's only in their own best interest when they make this available. So, back to Cornelius's kind of slightly wry, point. And I've made this point in grants myself to kind of argue why Instagram matters and others because of this dominance of Twitter as the key point of attention. I think we also need to recognize that the reason so many people are researching Twitter is because we've developed the methods, we've got good transparency there compared to the others. And so that's why the fight is so important. If we want to level that playing field out and so we end up with our conferences having more diversity of platforms and experiences, we also need to push for those platforms to open up and make it easy for us to study them. All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A good call to action for us and for new people coming into the field. Our next speaker is Tim Graham, and he's going to be talking about exploring participatory disinformation through coordinated network analysis. Please welcome Tim.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, everyone. So my paper today it's kind of a little bit more in the vein of what Stephen was doing. It's a bit more exploratory, and it kind of is trying to sketch out what I think is an interesting connection with a methodological toolkit and a kind of methodological turn in network analysis, and Kate Starbird's extremely powerful and new notion of participatory disinformation. So what I want to do, and this is way too ambitious for 15 minutes, but I'm going to try and get through as much of it as I can, and I'd love to hear if anyone's interested in this or wants to critique it or whatever. I'm going to run through, this is a methods section, so I'm going to run through a toolkit that's been developed, and some of you may be aware of this, to do kind of fancy network analysis that focuses on processes of coordination in social media data. I'm then going to completely switch over to participatory disinformation, highlight this again, connect it up with Kate's keynote. And then what I want to do is, if I get the time, to look at a case study of going way back historically to the 2016 US presidential election. I've been studying this for 5 years, found a whole bunch of new insights and results when we look at this through the lens of coordination. But frankly, the results that we got we can't make sense of them. And so I want to kind of open up that space a bit. So, coordination networks. Throughout the presentations, you've seen a lot of networks come up where social media data can be used. Surprise. Where social media data can be used to construct relationships, interaction relationships between different actors in those networks. So, one of the standard types of networks is retweet networks, where user A retweets user B, and you can, doing so, construct this kind of, I love this term, 30,000-foot map or overview of the structure of the interactions for a particular data set. But there's been, over the past few years, there's been this kind of turn in approaches to, and development of different kinds of approaches to doing network analysis. And I highlight here some of the work within the field of communication that's looked at ways to construct networks in a new kind of way, where the focus is not so much on direct interactions like Tim retweeted Axel Bruns or Tim retweeted Donald Trump or something like that. I'm not saying that I do, but in principle you could do that. And more on the connections between accounts who are amplifying or trying to post the same content together within a short period of time. So for example, if all of us were to jump on and retweet I don't know, Scott Morrison, for example, just to give an example. We would turn up in a coordination network because we are all connected together because we're amplifying this account. And so there's been a variety of different studies that have focused on different types of behavior. So we've got coordinated retweeting, we've got coordinated link sharing, which Dan kind of mentioned before. And you can construct these kinds of networks. Usually it's for single platforms, and usually it's for a single type of interaction, whether it's sending the same message together over and over in a short period of time, whether it's link sharing and things like that. And we kind of road tested this very quickly at the beginning of last year when the pandemic had started. We wanted to ask, okay, if we apply coordinated retweet analysis to the sharing of a racist conspiracy theory about the origins of the coronavirus, what would we find? And we published in this report, I mean, what we found was that this method is sort of unreasonably effective at finding the needle in the haystack, as it were, at finding really heavily concentrated clusters of accounts that were together reposting, or in this case, retweeting this kind of content over and over and over again. And so, of course, what we decided to do was go pro, and we set to making this something that could be more general. And I wrote some really crappy code that wasn't very well optimized. It was probably in the wrong language as well. So we got the real experts in, Sam Hames and Betsy Alpert from the Digital Observatory at QUT, to work with us to develop a toolkit that could generalize to different types of platforms, different types of data, and any type of kind of activity that you can think of. So I'm going so much slower than I intended in this talk. But what we've got is a toolkit that's open source at the moment. You can download it. You can use this on your own data sets. It supports currently 5 different types of behavior, if you like to call it that. And what it's focused on is generating networks that you can analyze using this mixed methods perspective. So you get your networks, and you can zoom in on clusters, doing qualitative analysis of those clusters, and sort of going back and forth between the network and the micro level, the actors, the content, etc. And so one thing that struck me earlier this year when I saw Kate Starbird's tweet thread that kind of set out this notion of participatory disinformation was that there seemed to be this kind of interesting connection between participation on the one hand and coordination on the other. And I think some of the points that Kate made this morning really sparked my imagination around, well, when you have a diagram such as this, where you're trying to understand disinformation as a dynamic process, a process that can't be located in individual content necessarily, can't be located in individual accounts, but can be located through a kind of feedback loop between different kinds of actors in a complex media system. And at the bottom, I guess at the bottom of this diagram here in the audience section, maybe I'll use this. Can I use this pointer? No, that's not the right one. Is the amplification that happens by the crowd. And this is kind of one of the key dimensions of this participatory disinformation concept. And another thing that struck me about this was the use of, and Kate referred to them as artifacts. I really like this idea. The use of these kinds of methods, and this is a retweet network. So this is kind of a standard approach. But what's really interesting on the left-hand side is that you do see that there are these audiences, crowds at the bottom who are amplifying the elites who are at the top, Donald Trump, pundits, officials such as General Flynn, and so on. And so what I wanted to do here, kind of in a really roughshod way, just to kind of put it out there, and it's a test balloon, I guess, if you like, is to ask the question, well, what can co-retweet analysis, what can coordination network analysis potentially bring to the study of disinformation as a dynamic process? And I think this is really just a question that I have. It's something that I'm toying with at the moment. It's not something that I particularly have any results with. But one thing that's really struck me is that I've been. Kate talked today about the 2020 US election and how participatory disinformation factors into that, and that there may be some application of this to the previous election as well. And I mean, I've been studying like the 2016 US election for for half a decade now. And, I fell into the trap of studying bots and trolls, because that was, foreign interference was kind of a dominant logic at that time. So published papers on bots, published papers on trolls, and we kind of exhausted that, and much of it has come under critique. So maybe a lot of my work is actually defunct now. But anyway, one thing we've really been focusing on is particular events, highly mediated, highly publicized events that have a seismic impact within that kind of information ecology. And again, this is work in progress that I've been working on with Florian Müller from the University of Bielefeld. And we're looking at a data set of what happened for 2 hours in the first US presidential debate in 2016. And we've kind of thrown everything at it. But when we threw the coordination network toolkit at it, what we found really shocked us. It kind of really surprised us about the unreasonableness of this method for telling us new things about, disinformation and the dynamics of it. And what we did is we set a pretty high bar. We said, okay, let's construct a network out of this data set where the accounts or the nodes in the network are connected together if they both retweeted the same tweet at least twice within 1 second of each other. So this is a pretty high bar to be connected together. You have to be basically amplifying the same content at exactly the same time. And as you can see in this diagram, which I don't know how, but it won an award like a couple of weeks ago, and I'm really bad with network visualizations. I'm remedial when it comes to this. But what you can see here, this is the co-retweet network that we generated from this data set. We went back and we retroactively queried the accounts to see what happened to them, what was their fate, were they suspended, are they still active, are they deleted? And you can see that there are these clusters that are just almost completely suspended by Twitter. Okay, great, it caught them. Maybe they're trolls, maybe they're bots, maybe they're something else. But what's really interesting, I'm going to skip ahead really quickly here. What's really interesting is that we found that in many of these clusters, 5 minutes, okay. What we found was that in many of these, I'm going to actually go back now that I know I've got 5 minutes. So we ran this clustering algorithm. We focused on the top 10 clusters. What the heck is going on in these bad boys? And what we found, and this was before I came across the concept of participatory disinformation, was that many of the clusters kind of could be understood, and we were applying public sphere theory here, could be understood as either kind of composed of elite actors, politicians, Donald Trump himself, political pundits, influencers, Fox News and things like that, or peripheral civil society actors who are grassroots activists, or maybe they're trolls, things like that, who are working together to amplify information. So really what we found was, this is not published work. We're still trying to make sense of this and figure out what to do. But this table shows that the political leaning of these different clusters, it really can be understood. And this is what really struck me about Kate Starbird's framework. It really can be understood in terms of this feedback loop between the elite and the audience, or the periphery, as we kind of framed it. Not all of it is disinformation, though. Not all of it is necessarily information disorder. But some of these clusters, it's not the big red clusters that are all suspended that I think are the most intriguing and problematic. It's the ones where the suspended accounts manage to get in to what appear to be organic activist networks and cultivate them to spread the preferred narrative that they wanted. So here I highlight cluster 744, which is mostly composed of pro-Trump, MAGA, anti-Hillary organic accounts. These are likely to be real people. But at the same time, there's these inauthentic accounts and accounts that have been suspended since. And what we see is that who they're retweeting, who they're amplifying are these elites. Donald Trump, Rand Paul, Fox News, political pundits. And they're coordinating together. They are spamming this stuff hundreds of times within a second of each other. In order to amplify this disinformation. And I guess what I'm toying with here is trying to understand and tease apart, what can this view of networks through the perspective of coordination potentially add to the notion of participation when it comes to disinformation? And so I guess to recap, this is a kind of roughshod sketch of something that I'm trying to piece together at the moment. I think that this coordination network toolkit, I really hope that it's of benefit to the research community. We're trying to make it cross-platform, so it accepts input from any kinds of different platforms. We're trying to generalize it to different types of behavior and things like that. And I think I would really love to see how this can be applied in the context of disinformation as a dynamic process, whether it's through the lens of participatory disinformation or through other frameworks, and just see what kind of comes out of that. Because, I mean, the biggest learning curve for me over the last few years has been to move away from focusing on individual content. 1 minute. Individual content, individual actors, and try to understand and appraise the interactions and the complexity of an intermediated, globalized media system. And that's not easy to do, but I think these networks, they do potentially kind of save a bit of time, and these artifacts do give you one entry point into trying to understand how coordination factors into the mobilization of discourses. So, oh man, I got another slide. All right, so there's a whole bunch of areas for future work. I think there's a number of theoretical areas and concepts that could map to this. But frankly, I would just love to see folks use this toolkit, and I'd love to chat about what it could potentially do for you and for your work. So yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks.
We've got two speakers for our final paper in this session. We've got Adriana Matamoros Fernandez, who, congratulations on her recent promotion. So, a wonderful thing. Ari's been punching above her weight for a long time, so it's good. And joining her is Louise Bartolo, and they're going to talk about examining the role of professionalization on YouTube in patterns of inauthentic behaviour on Twitter. Please make them welcome.
All right. So, yeah, thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to see familiar faces. So this is a project that we started last year with Louisa, Betsy from the Digital Observatory, and myself, and now it's under review. So we've written the paper. And although this is a method section, the paper contributes conceptually a bit to existing literature about why people engage in inauthentic behavior, so non-problematic uses of inauthentic behavior, and how to identify this inauthentic behavior. And our hypothesis that we tested was we wanted to explore a bit the role of professionalization on YouTube in patterns of inauthentic behavior on Twitter. So Louisa will give the introduction.
Thank you. Hopefully I know how to use this. Yay. Okay. Okay, so just as a bit of context for our project, as we've been hearing, as you all know, and as we've been hearing in the symposium, dis and misinformation are real societal concerns, and there are real fears around how they threaten public safety, public health, even national security. We also know that dis and misinformation are cross-platform issues, so we need a cross-platform focus to understand the breadth of them. Now, within disinformation crises like elections and COVID-19, there's been a tendency to talk about inauthentic behavior or bot-like behavior in relation to problematic conduct, so so-called bad actors operating with nefarious intent. And there's also been a focus on coordinated inauthentic behavior, as we've just heard. The challenge within this space is it's not exactly clear what we mean by inauthentic behavior, so it's a very open question what we're saying when we talk about something as being inauthentic. Relatedly, we don't know what thresholds platforms use to determine when conduct becomes inauthentic, and we don't have a full understanding of what the motives might be for engaging in inauthentic behavior. So to begin with, platforms tend to adopt a rather narrow definition of inauthentic behavior. Here we have a definition from Twitter, which is one of the platforms we looked at because we combined YouTube and Twitter. And it's worth noting that the word inauthenticity only becomes introduced into Twitter's policies in 2019, so relatively recently. The definition there is behavior intended to artificially amplify or suppress information or engage in behavior that manipulates or disrupts people's experience on Twitter. So clearly a very negative framing of inauthentic behavior. Now, this negative framing paves the way for a number of moderation approaches. So the specter of the 2016 US election and foreign interference particularly gives rise to this kind of securitized discourse around inauthentic behavior, and you get a crackdown on inauthenticity. The rules are vague, so how inauthentic behavior is defined isn't clear, and as a result, the enforcement of these moderation policies is also vague. And finally, platforms, because of this framing of the term inauthentic behavior, are able to argue that by being more transparent, they're opening the door to bad actors to circumvent their policies and pose a threat.
So on our work, we are building on scholarly research that is moving beyond these narrow conceptualizations of inauthenticity, right? So we have scholars that are talking about automated speakers. This is commonly known as bot accounts, so at the account level. But we have to differentiate between these automated speakers and automated behavior, because automated behavior could happen just in a short period of time. But you're not a bot, but you're engaging in this kind of inauthentic or automated like behavior for a short period of time for whatever reason. So this is the second one, that it's more what we are focusing on, automated behavior, that it's maybe also the use of scripts or automated tools to push information or the same information very in short periods of time. And then bot-like behavior, that it could be that it's not automated, but it's a user copying and pasting the same URL or the same message. And you can dedicate the whole day to tweet 50 times the same thing, because you have low resources and you want this information to really echo just someone finding this information. And what we are really interested in this research is that, especially on Twitter, this kind of automated communication has become a form of expression. And sometimes this form of expression has been linked to what Luisa was saying, to bad actors, to really wanting to manipulate. But because I was doing a bit of work around YouTube, around content creators, we thought that perhaps there was something going on with content creators also engaging in inauthentic behavior or automation as part of their tactics to become visible, right? So they have cross-platform strategies, and maybe they were going on Twitter and sharing their content in a way that it was a bit inauthentic, just to direct people from Twitter to YouTube and get more subscribers. So these are the common motives for engaging in authentic bot behavior that we know. For commercial purposes, this is more the spam. So we know that people go on Twitter and they have these spammy tactics. For political motives, creative, we have creative bots. And our hypothesis, as I already said, is, okay, what about professionalization, these content creators that really want to make a living? So to study the role of professionalization in non-problematic uses of inauthentic behavior, you have to start with a platform that has a clear monetization scheme. So we were interested in users that were tweeting YouTube URLs. So we could have done this with Twitch. So Twitter users that were tweeting Twitch URLs, or if you will, TikTok, although TikTok doesn't have a clear monetization scheme as YouTube and Twitch. And so we know that in YouTube, only a few make it, really. So if we have a long tail of content creators that really are trying hard to get noticed. Cross-platform strategies are really known, but maybe, as we investigated, maybe also tweeting a lot of times your own URL. And obviously, we started with Twitter, that we know that it's a well-researched platform, but as Dan was saying, it has a really open API, and it's really a platform where people go to promote their work. So it was really convenient for us to start with Twitter and seeing like how Twitter users were sharing YouTube URLs. So we have 3 research questions. The first one is this hypothesis, so does the quest for professionalization on YouTube play a role in patterns of automated inauthentic behavior on Twitter during newsworthy events like COVID? So we collected data during the early periods of COVID. The second question is, how are patterns of inauthentic behavior linked to the nature of YouTube content shared? So is there a relationship? And is the YouTube content shared problematic? And the third research question is, do platforms' inauthentic behavior policies hurt content creators trying to professionalize? Because if we are not clear about the thresholds of this kind of inauthenticity, maybe platforms, what are doing is taking down these accounts that at some point engaged in this inauthentic behavior. We collected data from Twitter from the 1st of February to the 31st of May, early stages of COVID, and we had more than 1 million tweets and more than 100,000 YouTube URLs that were shared. And this data was collected by the Digital Observatory. So in my previous work, I also visualized patterns over time with rank flows. So I used in the previous research, a tool developed by Bernard Reader, the rank flow tool that allows us to really identify these patterns over time. So what we did to make sense of this data and see whether there was like the role of professionalization in non-problematic uses of inauthentic behavior was to visualize the top 20 URLs that were shared every day for the period of like 4 months. So we had visualizations for February, March, April, and May. So we had different data. We knew the number of times that these URLs were shared, and we also knew the number of users that shared the same URL. But we were interested in the average time that a user was sharing this URL, because we couldn't visualize if we have one user sharing 2 times, another user sharing a URL 100 times. So we had to come up with an analytical tool that could help us identify this inauthentic behavior based on our data. So what we did is we divided these URLs that were shared on Twitter into bins. And so we were really interested in bin 2. And the bin 2 was the top 5% of average times tweeted users the average times tweeted this URL per user. So are like roughly 78 times per user on average share the URL. So we could consider that this is inauthentic. And we visualize it in these rank flows. And it was quite useful because we can see every column is a day, the bars are YouTube videos, and the color indicates whether if it's inauthentic or it's just a viral sharing. So all this light blue is just a Twitter user sharing a YouTube URL just once, right? So we just went to and look at bin 2.
Yeah, so then we follow that up with qualitative analysis, and here you can see the top 25 YouTube channels shared across our whole 4-month period, and they're split between the bins. So the first thing we can see by just looking at this, interestingly, is that the channels listed in bin 2 are far less well known than the ones you can see clearly in bin 0 there, Fox News, Vox. And so that makes sense that you've got kind of the more virally shared channels or ones that are widely known. But the lesser known nature of the bin 2 channels suggested it was like a sort of preliminary indication that perhaps, yes, content creators are using inauthentic behavior to try and promote these lesser known channels. But we needed to explore that further. So then what we did is we developed a coding scheme, and happy to talk about this in detail with anyone who's interested afterwards. But what we wanted to do was look at both the YouTube channels and the Twitter accounts sharing those channels, and then categorize the channels based on sharing motive. So what we get over here is the majority of the content shared inauthentically was shared for reasons other than professionalization. So that's 65% of the channels. And a lot of these were problematic. So we saw sharing of conspiracy theories and misinformation, as we've heard lots about. But interestingly, 1/3 of them, so 33%, were cases of professionalization. And in those cases, what we were seeing was YouTubers sharing links to their own YouTube channel, repeatedly in a single day. We'll give some examples in a moment. And there were aspects of the channel itself that showed they were trying to professionalize. So this was a channel asking people to subscribe, etc. Interestingly, the majority of these were non-problematic. So we had everything from spiritual content to infotainment, to news, and also some so-called subject matter experts, including a man claiming he was giving people exclusive access to some old concerts of Elvis Presley, for instance. So here's an example. This is The Green Light, which is a YouTube channel self-described as a storytelling platform. It features Bengali and Hindi content, including content about COVID. And what we saw in March was that their own Twitter account shared a video from their own channel 125 times in a single day. The video was very non-problematic. It was a lot of people from different parts of India urging people to follow lockdown rules. Here we have Mr. Honesty, who is, again, we found him sharing 2 of his own videos in April, and he shared one of them 153 times and the other one 125 times. And this was infotainment, kind of celebrity gossip with a bit of COVID mixed in. So finally, just to get back to our research questions, we found that yes, the quest for professionalization does play a role in these patterns of inauthentic behavior on Twitter. This is interesting for us because it ties in with previous work that content creators try to do whatever they can with the tools available to them to get noticed in a hyper-competitive space. The second point is we found, given that we mentioned that there has been this overly negative, potentially, framing of inauthentic behavior, we found that, yes, there are certainly cases of those, as I mentioned, so 65% of the channels were, most of those were kind of problematic sharing. But we also saw this professionalization motive of several content creators trying to use these inauthentic behaviors to get noticed. And one implication of this is that a content agnostic approach to content moderation could hurt content creators who are trying to monetize. So it's kind of an interesting question to ask, is there something wrong with that video from The Green Light that we saw being shared 125 times in a day when you consider that these are really sort of struggling to make it in a very competitive space? But that might be classified as spam and then removed. And then the final point is linked to what I just said, is that we were really interested to understand, do we know whether these policies are hurting content creators? This is really difficult for us to prove either way. We didn't find obvious cases of their accounts being removed. Even if we did, it would be hard to link it to that specific instance of what they did. And we also know that Twitter adopts a range of policies, not just removal of accounts. So it could give warnings to users, it could reduce their visibility. These are things it's not possible for us to observe. But I think our main point that we really wanted to drive home through this is that we think that a lot of the focus, understandably, around inauthentic behavior has been, first, there's been this sort of negative framing, but there's also been what if these platforms start to push back on inauthentic behavior and in the process silence political free speech? What we're arguing is that there should also be a focus on what might that mean for content creators who are struggling in an already competitive space. So thank you very much.
Questions from the audience? Online? Behaviour lot. So Essen's got a question.
Yep, thank you. The question is for Tim regarding your super interesting method. I just had kind of a possibility in mind that might happen around super acute events, but non-political, such as the death of a celebrity where millions of people might tweet the same thing around the same time, and that's not because of coordination, but just a coincidence. I wonder if there are methodological ways to distinguish mere coincidence just because an event is popular from it's being heavily retweeted around a very short span of time because it is coordinated?
This is a great question. What we're working on at the moment is trying to, this is a bit dry, sorry, but for those who are more kind of statistically interested in this approach, what we're trying to do is to ascertain using a Bayesian statistical approach, like what is a normal level of coordination? And by normal, I mean normal relative to what you see on any given day for a variety of different contexts, whether it's like death of a celebrity, political event, just general chatter, sports-related stuff, everything like that. And this turns out to be kind of a pretty hard problem, but I guess the tentative answer to that is that you either have to make a qualitative decision, go from the 30,000-foot view right down and just like you become so familiar with the data that it's just like you go insane, I can tell you. I think I might be. Or you take a statistical approach. And what we're working on at the moment is basically how do you analyze these types of networks statistically and be able to say, okay, you've got a cluster of accounts who are all, I don't know, trying to spam their own videos to become popular on YouTube or something like that. How out of the ordinary is that from a quantitative statistical point of view? And like this is the work I'm doing at the moment with a statistician, Bo Cui, who's a postdoc working with me on the DECRA project. So I don't know, it's a hard question, man, but a good one. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. I have a question for Ari and Louisa about some of the professionalization strategies that you guys noted. In some of the work that I'm doing with colleagues, Joe Gray and Rosie Gillett, we're looking at circumvention strategies on Facebook and how people try to get around being detected when they're doing coordinated behavior that appears to be inauthentic. So I guess I'm just curious to know if that entered any of the discourse in the videos that you were watching, or if people seem to be aware of the fact that, if they don't add small permutations to their link sharing, they're going to be detected, or if it's going to show up as flagged as spam or bot behavior or something like that.
I'll say something quick, and maybe Aradna has something to add. But on your point, we did notice that they changed their tweet slightly. Often they added new mentions and things like that. So I think there was never any case where it was exactly the same text, which was very interesting, even though they shared it 125 times in a day. In terms of not actually pointing to this is spam or this might get removed, we didn't find that, but maybe these creative tactics to make it look not too obvious as spam. I don't know, that's what I can.
No, yeah, and the thresholds for the only one that was removed different accounts were removed that we saw in our data. One was a Twitter account that tweeted the same YouTube URL 1,000 times. Whereas all the accounts that we saw within the professionalization, the average was really the 60 time, 140 times. But you don't imagine yourself pasting the same URL 40 times, even if it's a low threshold, it's interesting. And probably Twitter won't really flag this as inauthentic, but what about the 150? So we didn't really look at whether they were talking about this, but surely they have a well understanding that if they remain this kind of 60, 70, 100, probably they can get away with not being detected as a spam account.
We've got time for a couple more. Yep.
I've got a question from Zoom for Dan and Tim from Katerina Kasianenko. She's asking whether there are any other similar tools and examples of DMRC's involvement in open source communities and tools that you could highlight, similar to the coordination toolkit that Tim has developed?
Yeah, there are stacks and probably too many to list just here. So we have a GitHub that is you're able to access to visit and find some of the toolkits we're putting out. There's more activity in this space happening at the moment. So there are approaches, for example, with Instagram for gathering Instagram data and such. That's been an interesting one because there is a tension here at the moment between the open sourcing of some methods and platforms pushing back against those. So the case I will just highlight here is Instamancer, which was a great tool that we published to help gather Instagram data that was publicly available. So without login, you could gather Instagram posts that were made publicly. We publicized that quite heavily, and within 2 weeks, it was the endpoint it was accessing on Instagram was cut off. So there is always a tension here between tools, perhaps those for data collection, being made open and them being able to actually work because they are doing things that platforms don't want them to do. But certainly a lot of the workflows and such, it's something we're trying to improve is the kind of publication of these. The Digital Observatory, which I do work with as a research engagement leader, publish a lot of their kind of tooling online as well in an open source manner. Look, there are journals now which are publishing their stuff as well, which is great to see that people are being encouraged more and more to publish their stacks. But yeah, certainly a DMRC GitHub, I can provide a link if they require to that. And Axel's putting it on Twitter, I think, so that's perfect. I don't know, Tim, if you want to add anything to that. There's another, I'll just highlight another interesting tension here in terms of academic contributions, right? And academic contribution tends to be looked at in terms of papers. You get a paper out and it's great and it's awesome. Tool building is really difficult, very time and resource intensive, and very difficult sometimes to publish in a traditional form. So these are like an example of that non-traditional research output. And I would just say that we need to support those who are building the tools and doing this by making sure we're citing them in some way when we use those tools. Give them a nod. And just really help them do their work, because it sounds like I'm saying, hey, kind of give us a share or a like, but no, there are people who are driven to build the tooling and that, and if you do find it useful, give them a shout out, make sure you mention them in the paper, acknowledge that contribution, because it's necessary to get all the other awesome work done to have the tools and methods in place.
One more quick question, yes.
A question to Dan on the non-Twitter side of data collection. So a lot of the emerging platforms, something we'll talk soon about Gab, they're about radical transparency, about keeping everything transparent, which is great news for us because it's easy entry point for research, but also does it not help with information disorder, because bots and spreading misinformation becomes easier in that way. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, the cat and mouse game, right, of how much transparency, and when transparency starts to harm perhaps attempts. And I know Google and others have used this argument to hide, we're not going to share the details of the search algorithm because if we do, then people are going to game it. And this goes back to the very start of those platforms. Look, I do think that there is a necessary conversation and that some details, yes, necessarily have to be kept not hidden to some degree, perhaps in the current moment. But there are alternative models I've seen debated around ways to bring transparency to certain aspects of that platform that don't then also expose that to gaming or harm or such. Great example is this. You look at some of the great successes of Wikipedia and other platforms where there are models of radical transparency there, where debates around content, what is there or not, are there for all the public to see, and they work pretty well, right? They've developed governance mechanisms to deal with that pretty well. I think we can do better, and I do think it's a bit of a get out of jail free card sometimes to say, well, if we let everyone know all the details, then it would be flooded. The zone would be flooded with more, BS in the kind of old quote from this morning. I don't necessarily believe that to be true, right? That they're certainly hiding behind that to a degree.
Anyone else quickly?
Thank you. Timothy, with the suspected information operations, did you have a way of defining those operations to distinguish them from, say, like just fringe groups that might have a lot of partisan discourse but are not necessarily running an information operation?
It's so difficult. I really don't think that you can using trace data from social media. I mean, maybe some of the other presenters might disagree with that, but really the only ground truth, I guess empirical ground truth that we have for each of these accounts that turn up in these networks is what Twitter has themselves described as platform abuse, which has led to the suspension of these accounts. So that's why, I mean, we went back years later and queried Twitter to find out what happened to these accounts in the hope that we would be able to somehow tease apart that question, and that's really low-hanging fruit because that's just what Twitter has deemed to be inauthentic behavior. And even then, that's a new concept, as Ariadna and Louisa mentioned before. So what do you even mean by inauthentic? We just know that they're suspended now. So the answer to your question, I guess, is that we speculate, I think. You really can't get inside it. I guess what the Coordination Network Toolkit does and the other approaches as well is that they basically give you kind of like a statistical count. Like, how improbable is it that someone has spammed their own YouTube video 1,000 times in a day over and over? You're like, is that organic, authentic activity? I don't know. At the end of the day, sorry, there's no there's no answer. It's a bit of a slippery concept. Yeah, sorry.
We're out of time, so please thank our panel.